On October 25th, 1944, a man broke the ocean surface and began to look around desperately for the men he was with. After they were accounted for, they scanned the horizon for any land to swim to. What they saw instead, though, made their hearts sink. They knew in that moment that the next days of their lives, if they survived at all, would be horrific. This is their horrifying story, and as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. During the first half of the 1940s, the world was at war again, and one of the most important and decisive theaters was fought in the Pacific Ocean. And there, the war was fought across thousands of miles of open ocean. From the jungles of New Guinea to the shores of Iwo Jima, Japan, the conflict stretched more over ocean than land, and control of the seas often meant the difference between victory and defeat. And while battleships and aircraft carriers drew the headlines, much of Japan's downfall occurred as the result of submarines. The U.S. Navy's submarine fleet numbered nearly 300 and became the unseen force that broke Japan. Orders were to sink every ship carrying food, oil, weapons, and personnel that kept the empire alive, and U.S. submarines succeeded at a staggering scale. By the war's end, they had destroyed almost 5 million tons of Japanese ships, including more than 1,100 merchant ships and 200 warships. This kind of success didn't come cheap, though, and not just in monetary terms. The submarine service was one of the most dangerous assignments in the entire Navy, as 52 U.S. subs were destroyed during the war, taking with them the lives of more than 3,500 men. Patrols also often stretched for months in stifling heat with no daylight and no guarantee of a safe return. When enemy destroyers would move in, all a submarine could do was shut down the engines, hold their breath, and hope that the falling depth charges would detonate far enough away from the ship to avoid taking damage. And even worse, their greatest threat didn't always come from the enemy above the water. Sometimes it was the very weapons they carried themselves. American torpedoes were actually riddled with mechanical failures early in the war. Some exploded too soon, some not at all, and a few literally circled back toward the submarines that fired them. Like, for example, the USS Tang was destroyed by one of its own torpedoes in 1944. The USS Tang, meanwhile, was part of a new generation of American submarines designed to travel deep into enemy waters. It was sleek, tough, and it was built for long patrols and could carry 24 torpedoes at a time. It stretched just over 300 feet or 91 meters from bow to stern and was powered by a diesel-electric system. This allowed it to travel at 20 knots on the surface. It was something known as a Baleo-class sub, which were the workhorses of the Pacific Fleet. It was captained by Lieutenant Commander Richard H. O'Kane, who was a veteran of submarine warfare and had a reputation as one of the sharpest officers in the fleet. Life aboard the Tang, though, as with other submarines, was hard. The ship could carry around 90 men, and they basically lived elbow to elbow in narrow compartments with machinery constantly running and no real division between work and rest. The smell of diesel fuel, sweat, and steel was ever present, but morale on board was surprisingly high. The crewmen trusted their commander, their submarine, and one another, which was an important part of the Tang's success. Under Richard's command, the Tang would go on to earn 2 presidential unit citations and become one of the most decorated submarines of the war, and it all began with its first patrol in January of 1944. Like every new submarine, the Tang and its crew had something to prove. A typical patrol in the Pacific lasted around 2 months, depending on how long fuel and torpedoes held out. Each patrol meant sailing thousands of miles from base to stalk enemy convoys and hoping you could strike first and disappear beneath the waves before the escort ships would then find you. And success was measured in ships sunk and tonnage destroyed, and the Tang quickly became prolific in those categories. On that first patrol, the Tang went on an astonishing run, sinking 5 enemy ships and scoring hits with 2/3 of the torpedoes it fired. Richard's aggressive tactics worked, and the results spoke for themselves. Almost overnight, the Tang had joined the ranks of the Navy's most effective submarines. Their second patrol was less eventful, but it showed another side of Richard's leadership. While assigned to essentially lifeguard duty near the heavily defended island of Truk near Micronesia, the Tang spent weeks waiting to rescue American aviators whose planes had been shot down over the ocean. This would end up being a huge success, and by the time the Tang returned to port, the crew had pulled 22 pilots out of the water who would have otherwise been lost to sea. It was the Tang's third patrol, however, that cemented its legacy. Operating in the East China Sea and the Yellow Sea, it tore through Japanese shipping lanes. Complete convoys were burned, tankers were split in half, and massive freighters were sunk in minutes. On a single June day alone, the Tang destroyed 4 vessels, a feat few submarines could ever claim. And by the time the patrol ended, Richard and his crew had sunk 10 ships, totaling more than 39,000 tons of enemy shipping. Later that summer in 1944, the Tang was operating right off Japan's coast during its 4th patrol in territory most submarines considered a death trap. The waters there were shallow and heavily patrolled by sonar-equipped escort ships. On August 11th, the Tang came across a small convoy with 2 freighters and escort ships before Richard lined up his attack and launched 3 torpedoes at the larger ship and 2 at another. One of those torpedoes struck the big freighter's boiler room, triggering a massive explosion. The Tang then dove as Japanese escorts closed in and endured 38 tense minutes of depth charges before safely creeping back up to periscope depth to witness the devastation it had caused. By the fall of 1944, the Tang had already accomplished more in its short time in service than most submarines managed the entire war. The amount of tonnage sunk was a record, and it turned Richard into something of a legend among submarine captains. Still, this provided the Tang with little security, even as dominant as it was, and the next patrol would push the crew and their commander into some of the most dangerous waters in the Pacific. After a quick refit and resupply, the Tang left Pearl Harbor on September 24, 1944 for its 5th patrol. Its destination was the narrow Formosa Strait between Taiwan and China, which was yet another area that was feared among the submarine service. This is because Japanese destroyers knew the area well, and it was especially shallow, less than 200 feet or 61 meters in many places. A depth charge in deeper water might rattle a ship, but being in the vicinity of one in the Formosa Strait could literally tear a boat apart. Several weeks later, starting on October 10th, the Tang launched a series of devastating attacks on Japanese convoys. On the night of October 23rd, it surfaced in the middle of a massive 30-ship convoy and fired torpedoes in rapid succession. This would result in the sinking of 13 ships, which is a record single attack total in submarine warfare. And despite the chaos and near collisions with enemy ships, the Tang escaped unscathed. Then the next night, it struck again to sink 2 more freighters before disappearing back beneath the waves. Then, several hours later, at around 2:30 a.m. on October 25th, the Tang spotted a crippled Japanese transport ship drifting helplessly near Turnabout Island. By this point, the submarine crew was running on adrenaline through exhaustion after spending the previous 2 nights stalking convoys and dodging return fire, but Richard had no plans of saving the last 2 torpedoes. In his assessment of the state of the crew, he determined they still had enough for one final strike. Ordinarily, Richard would have kept his distance when firing, usually around 100 yards or more, but this particular target was so defenseless it posed little risk. The Tang then closed to within 700 yards before the crew shut down its engines. Submarines typically fired while moving to make themselves hard to locate, but Richard was opting for precision. He didn't want to waste either of the 2 torpedoes he had left to fire. On his order, the 23rd torpedo of the patrol left the tube cleanly. Moments later, it struck the Japanese transport ship carrying an estimated 5,000 Japanese soldiers squarely near the keel. This triggered an explosion that crippled the ship even further. Looking through the periscope, the crew could see debris and flames rising from it, but the vessel had yet to show signs of sinking. Richard then ordered the firing of the last torpedo, and what happened next was every submariner's new nightmare since the sinking of the USS Tang. The torpedo broke the surface almost immediately upon being fired, wobbled, and veered sharply to the left. It then curled in a wide circle toward the Tang's own position, and Richard shouted in order to reverse the engines and steer hard to port in a desperate attempt to dodge it. But the Tang never stood a chance. 20 seconds after leaving the tube, the torpedo slammed into the submarine near the back control room. The explosion then tore through the ship, throwing men against these steel bulkheads. The lights also went out immediately, plunging the compartments into total darkness, and smoke began to fill the air. Seawater also poured into the Tang, and the 3 rear compartments flooded within moments. In the badly damaged control room, chaos broke out as the men tried to regain their bearings after being tossed around like rag dolls. Several of them suffered broken limbs at the moment of the explosion, and those stationed in the submarine's conning tower were hurled down the ladder as the ship moved violently beneath them. One of these men even broke his back in the fall, and another snapped his neck. Despite the injuries though, a few of the others in the control room managed to seal off the hatches to slow the flooding, but one rear hatch wouldn't fully close and water kept rushing in. As this was going on, the Tang began sinking fast, and soon its stern impacted the seafloor with its bow angled upward at nearly 45 degrees. The depth gauges showed 180 feet or 55 meters, which was shallow by submarine standards, but deep enough to make escape nearly impossible. For those in the flooded rear compartments, death was almost instant, but some men survived in other sections. The survivors, maybe 30 in total at this point, then gathered in the forward section. As they assessed the situation, the sound of waves could actually be heard washing over the ship, confirming that the bow was still above water. However, this was actually a problem. In order to have any chance of escaping, the submarine needed to be level. One of the injured men then managed to activate the flooding valves for the forward ballast tanks, allowing seawater to rush in and bring the sub level. This was a risky move, but it worked, and soon after, the Tang settled flat on the sea floor. This meant the immediate danger had passed, but now they faced a slower one. Trapped 180 feet below the surface with dwindling air, the men had a choice to make. Either wait for a rescue that would probably never come, or attempt an escape that had never been done before. To escape the submarine, the survivors would need to use the escape chamber, which was a small pressurized room designed for emergencies. It could only fit a handful of men at a time, but it was their only option. And considering the chaos around them, the men stayed remarkably calm, even without their commander's presence. Richard had actually been blown off the bridge when the torpedo struck and was thrown into the sea, so command of the escape mission fell to the senior men still stuck inside. And shortly after, the survivors made an orderly line to the escape chamber. What they would have to do next would be far from an easy escape, even in calm conditions. In fact, it would be almost unprecedented, but to make matters worse, a Japanese patrol was circling the Tang from above. Every so often, depth charges were dropped into the water and shook the hull of the damaged submarine. These nearby explosions would actually fill the Tang with the smell of burning insulation, and one particularly close detonation triggered an electrical fire near the forward battery, causing smoke to pour through the passageways. The heat also climbed fast, making the escape all the more important to pull off quickly. By the time everything was ready to go, it was dawn and breathable air was dwindling quickly. The men then readied their Momsen lungs, which are small breathing devices strapped to the chest that allow for a slow and controlled ascent. No crew had ever used them in real emergencies, and they had only been used in practice sessions inside training tanks. But now, the lives of the tank survivors depended on them. One by one, the crew tested the valves and nose clips, checking for leaks and ensuring that their devices were ready. The escape chamber itself was barely big enough to move in and was about the size of a phone booth. The way it would work is that 4 men would squeeze into it at a time, and once inside, the chamber door would be closed and the room would be filled with seawater. They would then wait for the pressure to be equalized, and the escape hatch would then be pushed open, and they'd kick upward through the darkness, guided by a rope attached to a buoy that was rigged to float on the surface. Or at least, that was how it was supposed to work. One sailor, George Zoffson, admitted while waiting for his turn that he couldn't swim. So rather than join the others in attempting to escape from the Tang, he simply turned away and went back to his bunk, where he lay down and waited to die. The first group went up around 6 a.m., the next 4 went after them, and then another 4. As each group waited their turn, they all knew that any hesitation meant death for everyone still inside, but in the chaos, only 13 survivors managed to make it out of the escape hatch. By the time the last few men climbed into the escape chamber, the fire from the forward battery was raging. The metal around them was so hot that paint was literally melting off the bulkheads and running down the walls. Their eyes burned from the heat and the fumes as the men sealed themselves in the escape trunk and waited for the water to rise. But just making their way through the hatch to the open sea outside was no guarantee they'd survive the trip to the surface. Keeping hold of the buoy line was the difference between life and death. At 180 feet underwater, it's pitch black, and the sailors wouldn't be able to tell up from down once they were through the hatch. By grabbing hold of and following the line, they'd keep their bearings and eventually reach the surface. But in the confusion and pitch darkness outside the hull, many of the survivors lost their grip on the buoy line and drifted away in the sea. In the end, only 6 of the 13 men who escaped from the Tang reached the surface alive. The rest were overcome by exhaustion, disorientation, or any number of potential things that could have gone wrong between the escape hatch and the surface. Those who survived then floated in the open sea, using their Momsen lungs to stay afloat as the sun rose over the horizon. They were alive, but just barely, and meanwhile, 78 of their fellow crewmen and officers were dead, lost either in the explosion or during the escape. Among the dead was a 15-year-old named Reuben McNeil Rayford, who was likely the youngest American to die in combat during the entire war. The survivors would have no time to grieve or even be thankful to survive, though. They were now miles from land and surrounded by enemy ships. When daylight broke over the Formosa Strait, the sea was calm as the survivors clung to debris and scanned the horizon for any sign of help. Unfortunately for them, all they could see were Japanese ships. By mid-morning, a Japanese frigate known as the P-34 spotted them. The men tried to keep still, hoping to be ignored, but the ship suddenly changed course and headed straight toward them. And even worse, on its deck were survivors from vessels the Tang had sunk in the days before. Some of these men were badly burned from steam and fire, and their bandaged faces and blistered skin made them almost unrecognizable as humans. A whaleboat was then dispatched from the P-34, and the Tang survivors could see men rowing toward them with their rifles, and when the Japanese sailors reached them, the tone was clear from the start. The survivors were then dragged onto the boat before being savagely attacked. One of the Tang survivors was also already weak and struggling to breathe from inhaling so much water on his ascent, But instead of helping him, his captors pushed him back into the water and rowed away, leaving the ocean to finish him off. When the 5 remaining survivors reached the P-34, they were reunited with 3 of their surviving officers, including Richard. That meant that among the 87 on board the Tang at the time of the explosion, these 8 were all that remained. Once they were all on deck, the brutality continued. The men were stripped of their gear and their hands were bound behind their backs. They were then forced to sit on the ship's steel deck without any protection from the sun and without any food or little water for 5 days and nights. The heat scorched their skin, giving them blisters across their backs and shoulders. The crew also taunted them, sometimes yanking their heads up by their hair and shoving lit cigarettes into their noses or ears. When the P-34 finally made its port in Formosa, the Americans were marched through the streets with their hands tied and hoods pulled over their heads. Civilians came out to watch, and children, old men, and women hit them with sticks as they passed by. That night, they were thrown into a root cellar where they scavenged raw potatoes from the dirt floor to survive. This was the first thing they'd eaten in nearly a week. The next day, they were loaded onto another vessel bound for Japan. The ship carried a cargo of sugar, and the survivors of the Tang were kept below deck in choking heat and given almost nothing to eat or drink for the entire voyage. By the time they reached Japan, the survivors had already endured more than most men could imagine, but their suffering was far from over. What awaited them inside the walls of the Japanese prison camps would pale in comparison to their treatment to that point. Their first stop was the interrogation camp at Ofuna, which wasn't the sort of place that showed up on maps. The Japanese government didn't acknowledge that it existed, and the prisoners there weren't listed as captured servicemen. They were stripped of their names and rights. The guards told the survivors outright that they were not considered prisoners of war at all, but instead war criminals. Their reasoning was that the Tang had targeted and sunk civilian ships, and by that logic, its surviving crewmen were murderers. This was verifiably false, but that unfortunately didn't matter at the time. The treatment of the Tang survivors afterward matched the accusation. The men were kept in total isolation, forbidden from speaking to one another or anyone else in the camp. They were fed barely enough food to stay alive, and when they failed to answer questions to the guards' satisfaction, savage attacks began. The survivors were already starved and dehydrated when they arrived at Ofuna, but within weeks they were thin almost to the bone. Their hair fell out in clumps and their teeth loosened from scurvy. They were even stricken with a condition known as beriberi, a vitamin B deficiency that causes weight loss, limb pain and weakness, and even heart failure. Richard, one of the Navy's most esteemed commanders, spent his days confined to a small, windowless cell and was weakened to the point of barely being able to stand. Then in early 1945, the entire group of survivors was transferred north to the camp at Omori, located on an island in Tokyo Bay. It was still winter by this point and the cold was brutal. The prisoners were forced to march through the snow barefoot, and the barracks they were kept in were little more than unheated and drafty shacks that were infested with lice. Their meals came twice a day and consisted of small bowls of rice mixed with barley, or if they were unlucky, nothing but hot water with a few grains floating in it. And the guards there continued to treat them as less than human as well. Beatings were routine and often came from nothing more than glancing up without permission. Over time, the survivors learned to move slowly and speak quietly. Any sense of defiance was beaten out of them, and in a way, even just maintaining their dignity would be seen as an act of rebellion. Months would go on like this with no word outside Omori's walls. The men could hear distant air raids over Tokyo, but they had no idea how the war was progressing. Then in August of 1945, the bombings just stopped. The guards' attitudes also seemed to change overnight as they suddenly became uncertain and quiet. One day, most of the guards were simply gone, and the one who remained told the survivors that the war was over. From that point on, the prisoners controlled the prison, and within weeks, Allied aircraft appeared overhead, dropping supplies to them. Finally, on August 28th, the Tang survivors were liberated. Emaciated and sick from malnutrition, they were flown to Guam for medical treatment before they were well enough to return home. All 8 of the men who lived long enough to become prisoners of war survived the entire ordeal. Each of them would carry scars that would last a lifetime, both seen and unseen. They never forgot the sound of that torpedo exploding near the control room or the darkness that followed it. And years later, they still carried the weight of what they'd seen and lost in October of 1944. Although Richard was hailed as a hero, he rarely spoke about the ordeal himself. When he received the prestigious Medal of Honor for his actions and leadership, he accepted it on behalf of his crew and called them the bravest men he ever knew. The wreck of the Tang still rests in the Formosa Strait, and its exact position is known only in rough coordinates.